class this morning. We are live streaming, so we got to start on time because they're tuning in, hopefully, at home. The fellowship hall class is not meeting today. The teacher is ill, and so they're going to funnel all those folks into here with us. And, of course, we got plenty of room. They can come in and sit down, or if they want to, they can stand in the back or sleep in the balcony, whatever they want to do, but whatever's fine with us. Beautiful day. We're looking at the book of Esther. And today we want to look at chapter 1. And the question we read about as we get started is, who was this Ahasuerus? And do a little bit of linguistic studies this morning and talk about him. Now, in Esther chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. Now, this Ahasuerus ruled from India to Ethiopia, and I think the map is a little bit better today, maybe not on the screens up there, but here's the map of the Persian Empire over which Ahasuerus reigned. Now, he inherited this from his father and his grandfather, Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, and Darius the Mede, the king of Elam, joined their forces, and they destroyed Babylon around 536, 78, somewhere in that area, and became then, by right, the world empire. They basically ruled over that much of what we think of as the civilized world. So this map encompasses on the east side the Indus River, which is the main dividing line before you get into India, or west of India, and all the way to Greece. Now, he did not rule over Greece, but he did over what we think of as Macedonia. So you think of Paul's missionary journeys. He went to Thessalonica and Philippi, that area. So that was part of what he ruled over. He also conquered Athens, but he never went down past Corinth and conquered what we think of as the Isthmus of Greece. But he did reign all the way down to Egypt and Ethiopia, which involves the land of Canaan or Palestine, all of Asia Minor, and possibly parts of what we used to think of as Russia, Mongolia, a large, vast empire over which Ahasuerus ruled. Now, Cyrus the Great, Darius the Mede, they conquered all of this, and somewhere in the process, Darius falls out of the picture, mainly by death. But Darius is important because he's the father of this Ahasuerus. We'll get to that here in just a moment. For those that there are notes in the Bible app. You can follow along. You can take notes. You can answer. I got some questions there for further study if you want them, and some suggestions for further discovery. Download the Bible app if you need help, and some have asked me for that help. I'll help you get into that and find it. Just look for events, and then you'll find those notes there. The main theme of the book of Esther is how Esther becomes, and this is kind of a review, becomes the Queen of Persia, and how she saved the Jews from extermination, which began what we think of as the Feast of Purim, which is the feast that Jesus attended in John chapter 5. The events of this time period date around 485 to 465 BC, and you understand, remember that BC stands for about correct. So any date we give before Christ is approximate, pretty close. And if you read this commentary, and then you go and read this commentary, and then you go read this dictionary, they may all three have different dates within a year or two of each other. So just kind of bear that in mind, that they're only getting approximate on some of these. Esther fits historically with Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll see a little bit of this in just a minute. In fact, the events of Esther occur between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. So if you read Ezra like I asked you to last week when we got to chapter 6, that's everything that applies before Esther's story. And then beginning in chapter 7 of Ezra, the things that occurred after Esther's story. Now, the kings of Persia that are involved in part of our study, Cyrus the Great reigned from 539 to 530, replaced by his son Cambyses, who was not well liked. He's replaced by Darius, and then by Xerxes, and this Darius is Darius Hystaspes, or Darius the First, he's sometimes called. It's also called Darius the Second. The numbers are kind of confusing, so don't worry about that. And Xerxes replaced by Artaxerxes, his son. Now, Artaxerxes is the king for Nehemiah, and as well as for Ezra. Now, the ones that involved in this study, Cyrus, in 536, in Ezra chapters 1 and 2, issued a decree that all the Jews that wanted to could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Now, if you do the math, God told through the prophets, mainly Jeremiah, that there was going to be 70 years that Judah, Jerusalem, would enjoy a Sabbath. In other words, there would be a 70-year period where the Jews would not be there. They were going to be out in exile. So from 606 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came from Babylon and took Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and others, princes of Judah, captive to Babylon, to 536, when Cyrus issued a decree for them to go back and rebuild the temple, that's 70 years. And then from the final destruction in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar till the time the temple was completed in 516, you've got another 70 years. So it works out pretty well. God was in charge. All right, during the reign of Cambyses, Ezra chapter 4, the construction work, the rebuilding work on the temple was stopped. And if you read Ezra, you find how that story worked out. Then Darius, whichever number he was, and it should say 516 there, but we've got a mistake. My finger hit the wrong button on that, or like one of my teachers used to say, my secretary made a mistake. It should say 516, the temple was completed. Haggal and Zechariah, those two prophets, fit into this time frame as they encouraged the people to finish the construction of the temple. And just for the fun of it, after all of this, like almost 100 years later, Nehemiah comes on the scene to rebuild the walls. So all that's coming up later on. But that's Ezra chapters 5 and 6. This is the Darius that put Daniel in the lion's den. Then we get to Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, and he is the king during the reign or the time of Esther. But this raises the question, and I'm going to skip this next one. How do we get Xerxes from Ahasuerus? Chapter 1 of Esther, verse 1 says, and it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. But if you read elsewhere, you'll read this name is Xerxes. So how do we get from that to this? Well, it's kind of a simple explanation. Herodotus is called the father of history. He lived during this time frame, and he wrote his histories, including the story of Xerxes or Ahasuerus, and he called him Xerxes. And I was reading over this, and I wondered, we got Herodotus is the father of history, and we've got this person is the father of medicine, and this person's the father of this. Where are the mothers? I've often wondered about that. We talk about the four fathers of our nation. Where are the four mothers? We always leave them out. Sorry, ladies. You got skipped over there. But anyhow, Herodotus is the one who calls Xerxes, or gives this name to the king. The king's real name in Persian is that one. Y'all go ahead and pronounce that if you want to. Khshayarsa. Khshayarsa. There's a hard K at the beginning that's kind of softened up. But that's in Persian. Khshayarsa. Or Khashyar Shah. Now, in Persian, it's Khashyar Shah. When they wrote the Hebrew Bible, whoever the author here is, whether it be Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordecai, or Esther, or whoever, writing in Hebrew, and just for the fun of it, Hebrew is read from right to left, not left to right. They put down some kind of a transliteration. Now, transliteration occurs when you go from language A to language B, and you take language A letters and you put language B letters. That's how we got our English word baptism. The King James translators did not want to translate that immersed like they should have, so they transliterated it. They took the Greek beta and made that in English B. The Greek alpha made that in English A. The Greek pi made that in English P, and so forth. And that's how we got baptism. So when the Hebrew came along and they were writing this down, they wrote it down Ahasuerus. And that's what that says in Hebrew. If you believe me, that's okay. If you don't believe me, that's okay. I don't mind. But then when the Septuagint was made 200 years before Christ, actually 200 or so years after these events in Esther, they translated from Hebrew into Greek. And that translation came out as Artaxerxes. And so, and again, another transliteration. So translating from one to another, we get these kind of different concepts. And I also read that maybe that Herodotus, being a Greek author, living on the far western edge of Persia, got the name kind of misunderstood between the original Khashyar Shah to his Xerxes. And somewhere along the way, we probably all played this game where I'd whisper something in this person's ear and they're supposed to pass that message along. By the time it goes around the circle, the message has been completely changed because we misunderstood somewhere along the way. And so if you start off with the robin laid a blue egg, by the time it gets around to the other end, it's a chicken who hatched an egg. Because as we pronounce it and mispronounce it, and as it's misunderstood through the cycle, it can be changed. So this is probably how we got the word Xerxes. So who was this Xerxes? Xerxes was the son of Darius the Great. He was born around 519 BC. His mother was Atassa, who was the daughter of Cyrus the Great. And I find it interesting, both his father and his grandfather have the same middle name. I'll let you think on that one. So he was of royal descent from both sides of that beginning of the Persian Empire, both of the Persians and the Elamites. He was, let's see how to say this, temperamental. He wanted to expand the borders of the kingdom, the empire, and in some ways he failed. He reigned from 486 to 465, and the first couple of years of his reign, there were a number of rebellions in Egypt and in Babylon, and he basically was able to squash those rebellions to the point that, and by the way, he was very religious for his religion and kind of intolerant of other religions. Kind of keep that in mind as the story unfolds. But when he got down to Egypt, he destroyed their pagan temples. In Babylon, he destroyed their temples, trying to get them to not worship their gods and kind of unite under his God. And he worshiped Zoroastrianism, if I can pronounce that right. So he squashed these rebellions. And then I got some dashes and a question mark there. And you wonder what that's all about. Verse 3. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for his princes and attendants. Verse 3 fits right there in those dashes. In the first 2 years of his reign, he squashed these rebellions in Egypt and in Babylon. And then he has set up this big banquet. Let's go back to beginning in verse 2. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Now, if you're reading through that and just kind of glance over that, folks, that's a 6-month banquet. We thought Thanksgiving and its leftovers were bad. 6 months of banquet, followed with a 7-day banquet. Now, folks, if you're not satisfied after all of that, you deserve to be hungry. That's just the way that goes. So you wonder, what in the world's going on? This massive banquet was a fundraiser and a uniter or effort to unite. And you read who all was attendance there. And it's not uncommon for those kings of that time frame to hold such banquets. One guy, and I forget which one it was now, is said to, see if I can find his name here, is said to have had 70,000 people at a banquet. Now, I don't know what it'd take to feed them or what they'd have to eat. But this was not a one-day affair. This was a month or 2 or 3 or 4 long effort. I'd hate to be a chef back in those days. But so this is what he did. And another one had another 150,000 people at a banquet. You think, where did they fit them? What did they do with them all? How could they all get there and eat and enjoy the fellowship, of the meal? This was not your standard dinner on the grounds. After this banquet, Ahasuerus amassed an army and a navy. Some accounts say that in the army there were like 10 million soldiers. Others dropped that down to 150,000. It was a massive army. He also had a massive navy. Now, the trouble was, when he took off on this in his 4th year of his reign, and he went to attack Greece, he wanted to bring Greece in for the riches and for the trade. Because if you go back and you study about Corinth and that area, that was a major port, stopping port for all the trade across the world at that time. Rome was up and coming. It wasn't the nation that would be during the time of Jesus and before and after, but it was up and coming. There was trade all the way around what we think of as Europe, even up to the British Isles, and to the east of Africa or west of Africa and around to India and China. So all that was happening. So if I can enlarge and take that, then I'll control more property, more territory, have more wealth coming in. But this massive navy that he had was destroyed at Salamis, and his army was destroyed at Plataea. Have you seen or heard about or looked into the movie The 300? Okay, that's this. That's the army that the 300 Spartans held to pass and held them off until the army behind them could get ready. That's where this takes place. Now, it's interesting that Xerxes' father, Darius, had made the same effort, had tried to conquer Greece, and he failed. So when he had failed, and that was like several years before Xerxes came on the throne, when Xerxes or Ahasuerus came on the throne, he tried it. He also failed. The Greeks just didn't want to be conquered, I guess. They did not want to pay tribute to Persia. So all that is taking place in this time frame. So that's where he was after events of chapter 1. Now, when he comes back after this attempt to conquer Greece, returning from the defeat in Greece, he sought comfort from his harem. Now, Herodotus, the Greek historian, explains or points out that when he comes back from this failed effort, he sought comfort from his harem. That's the story of Esther chapter 2. Vashti having been deposed, he comes back and he says, "Where's my wife? You ain't got one." He practiced monogamy. He had one wife, over 300 ladies in his harem, and he had a number of exploits with them, but he was monogamous, one wife at a time. Now, that doesn't make sense, I know, but that's what we read. All right, Esther chapter 1. Let's get into the text. In the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which is at the citadel in Susa. The citadel in Susa occupied about 10 acres. Okay, that's a pretty good size spot of territory. That's one building taking up 10 acres. It was probably a walled affair, and within those walls were a number of courts. There were a number of gardens, kind of like a park area with rivers and lakes and ponds and fish and fruit trees and all kind of fun things like that. It was a masterful area. And some of these, let's see, keep reading there, verse 3. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants. Now, that's going to be people from all over his empire. So So you go back up to the map and you think of how large that area was. He had people there from Egypt and Ethiopia, from India, from Palestine, from Asia Minor, from Macedonia, from all these areas, all these different nationalities, all the princes. Can you imagine this? The guy walks into his wife. He's the principal leader of his country, and he says, honey, I've got to go to Susa for a banquet. I know it's October. I'll probably be back May, maybe June. And she says, okay, enjoy. You think about that. I'm going to be gone for 6 months for a banquet. Now, I kind of expect him to waddle back home after eating all that. But anyhow, so that's what's going on. So he has this big banquet for all of his army officers, all of his nobles, all of his princes of all the provinces. They're all there. Now, what we don't catch is that meanwhile, the ladies are having a banquet too. That comes up a little bit later on. And it seems that there was an area where the men would assemble and banquet. And somewhere I read that the part of this banquet hall was like 150 feet long and 50 feet wide, kind of like an open gazebo. And that's where the main banqueting took place. But there may have been several thousand people there. And so they would probably interchange as to who got to sit at the table in the presence of the king. Meanwhile, the women had their own banquet. Now, just let your imagination run as to what took place to do all the food preparation for all of this. But this third-year banquet was designed to raise support for his attack on Greece. 6 months of banquet followed by 7 days of banqueting. So let's read on. Verse 4, as he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for this 180 days. It was not uncommon for the king to have the safe opened up. It's kind of interesting. You go into the bank and you look around and there's the money vault, the safe, standing at the door, wide open. All that money sitting in there. They got a 19-cent ink pen chained to the table for you to write with. I always find that to be odd that they do it like that. But he had the vaults open. He would have his servants walking around carrying large amounts of gold or silver, demonstrating his wealth. That seems to me to be kind of counterproductive. I've got all this money, but I want all you contribute to this conquest we're about to try. But that's what he was doing. And it's not uncommon for the kings of that day and age to demonstrate their glory and their power by exhibiting their wealth and their riches. While these days were completed, or when these were completed, verse 5, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So this citadel occupied about 10 acres, but there was a court which is more like a park. There was this long colonnade that was probably overlapped, as we read verse 6. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings, marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. So you've got a mosaic floor in this colonnade covered like a gazebo with these hangings of fine linen, of white and purple, silver, couches of gold and silver. When we think of a banquet, we've got this gigantic table, all these chairs, we're sitting elbow to elbow, and we look down and say, now, is that my fork, or is that my spoon, or is that your spoon? So we're studying there, Emily Post-Adequate, to figure out whose silverware is whose. And, is this my glass, or is that yours? We're that close. They had couches. Just think love seat. Cut off the legs, put it flat on the floor, and lounge on that. And you're not just lounging, you are relaxing. And you have servants that have come around non-stop offering you foods. And they'll bring about trays of grapes and apricots, and figs, peaches, and pears, and apples, meats of different kinds, breads of different kinds. Okay, so this is all this luxury going on at one time. So it was not just a, let's sit down and eat, have a little speech, and go home. No, this was a monster of a banquet that he held. By the way, all that demonstrates his glory, his power, and his wealth. Just think of the floor that they had, decorated with these mosaics. Verse 7, drinks were being served in golden vessels of various kinds. The royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. Okay, now, there was drinking according to the law. Okay, you mean they had a legal requirement for drinking? They did. When the king drank, you drank. If the king didn't drink, you didn't drink. That was the law. So if the king wants to drink every time he blinks, you're going to drink too. And it's impolite. In fact, it's death sentence if you don't drink when the king drinks. However, the king could excuse the law. And that's what he said. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. The king could say, okay, you drink at your own leisure. You don't have to drink when I drink. And there's somebody said, I was about to choke on that last piece of chicken. I had to have something to wash it down, but without the king drinking, I couldn't wash it down. Now he raises that rule and says, drink at your own free will. So there was an open bar policy. But you didn't go to the bar, you just kind of held up your glass. And you didn't get it up very high before a servant was there with a golden vessel to pour wine into your cup. And these were not just pitchers made out of gold. These were very elaborate gold-fashioned, carved, or whatever vessels. It took more time to admire the beauty of the vessel than it did to drink the wine they poured into your cup. So this was quite an affair that's going on here in the palace at Susa. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Some book that I read demonstrated that the Persian king would have a meeting with his favored men, a banquet in a room, not an open court like this was. But there were windows up above, kind of like we have a balcony. And the women met up there. The women could not come down to where the men were. And the men could not go up to where the women were. But the women could look in through the veiled windows, curtained, and they could see the men and see what was going on. They sometimes could hear what was being said. But they had no voice in the goings-on down below. Now, that was in another setting, another king, another time. But that's kind of the framework. So there was an area in the palace for the women. So Vashti, verse 9, gave a banquet for the women in that palace. Now, was it just her women, her attendants? Was it the 360-some ladies that were in Ahasuerus' harem? Did it include the women who came with the men that were down below in the court there with the king? Their wives and their wives' attendants? You know, when we think of taking a trip today, we get our suitcase, we pack up our suitcase, we get the kids, pack up their suitcases, load them up in the car, take off. We got all our little family and one little SUV, and we're good. No, not them. When this invitation to this banquet went out, it was a major operation to attend because you did not go by yourself. You had your servants, you had your women, you had your women's servants, you had other servants to go with you. You would even have herdsmen who would bring a small flock with you. I mean, you had to eat along the way. You're traveling some 1,000 miles. It took Ezra and his entourage about 4 months to get from Susa to Jerusalem, and he was in a hurry. Now, you're making this little trip, and it may take you a year to get there because you're not traveling from point A to point B. You're traveling from here along the way, and you're stopping here. You're going to the market there. Fellas, just imagine you're not on the interstate. You're going through every small town, and she wants to stop at every single antique store and Walmart and you ain't getting there quick because you're going to have to take the slow route because she wants to stop at every one of these little places. Now, magnify that by the fact you're not carrying just the wife and the kids in the SUV. You've got 100 or so servants with you and all the entourage, and camels don't go that fast. You're going along at a pretty slow pace because you've got all this entourage and all these animals that had to be brought along with you. And you don't travel from breakfast to supper because you get up in the morning, they have to fix breakfast, they have to pack up, then you move, and before it gets dark, you have to unpack, set up tents, cook supper, and so you're not traveling but 4, maybe 5 hours a day. You might make 10 miles. Okay, you think about that. So this is a slow process. So all these people finally get themselves to this banquet. Maybe some of them arrived late, maybe some of them got on time. But you thought of that, how this would have taken place, and just kind of imagine, let your imagination run, and see how this crowd, the ebb and flow, and how they would go. So it was a pretty interesting idea to get them all there. Now, going on. Meanwhile, Vashti, verse 10. On the 7th day of this second part of the banquet, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Menuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. You don't have to be able to pronounce those names. I don't either. The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, beginning with actually Nebuchadnezzar, and even before, but Nebuchadnezzar is the one we can lay a finger on. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were taken to Babylon. They were made eunuchs to serve in the king's court. These eunuchs here named were in charge of the king's harem, being castrated. There's no way they could in any way affect any of the women. There's no way they could have a child by any of the women and thus claim the child should be heir to the throne. And so there was a lot going on there, and there's reason for that. In fact, they had them back in the time of Jezebel. They're the ones that threw Jezebel out the window for Jehu to run over, backing up into 2 Kings there. But all this is, that's why he had the eunuchs, to take care of all of these women. And some seem to indicate that there was a group of women in this part of the harem and a group in this part of the harem, and they each had different sets of eunuchs to take care of them. Possibly so, because this was the culture of that day. So anyway, verse 11, he sent them to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused. You do not say no to the king, but she did. Now the question is raised, okay, she was invited from her banquet to go to their banquet to display her beauty. Rule number 1, the women are not seen by the men. Period. The men don't go looking for the women. The king could go to the harem, and he could call for one of the harem or his wife to come to him. But the rest of us never got to see them, if there was any transportation involved. So when they went to Susa in the summer and went to another palace in the winter, when they were transporting from one to the other, the women were carried in screened cabinets, for lack of a better word. They were covered so they could not be seen by any other men. None of the men there had ever laid eyes on Vashti. They did not know how beautiful she was or was not, because it was against the law for any other man than the king or these eunuchs to see the queen. So the king here issues this rule: I want the queen to come down and demonstrate her beauty to all of my nobles. Now, this is after the 7-day feasting or banqueting. But what was she to show? Now, he had shown all of his wealth and all of his riches. But he had one more thing very beautiful, and that was the queen. And perhaps he was drunk out of his mind. Perhaps he had a stupid spell. We all have those from time to time. But he wanted Vashti to come. Now, there are some commentaries who say that he wanted Vashti to come down and do a striptease for all of his nobles. That's pretty far-fetched. It seems easy to understand that he wanted her to come down and wear her crown to show its beauty as well as demonstrate her beauty. That means she would have to remove the veil from her face. And that was another no-no. When the king would go to see the women, when he was announced, they would veil their faces. That was the rule. But for her to unveil her face before all of these nobles, and she said no. He wanted her to demonstrate her royal beauty, and she refused. Why? Did she have scruples? I think so. I think Ahasuerus was under the influence maybe of his drink or of his wicked counselors, and they invited and thus encouraged him to invite her down, and she saw that. But she also respected the basic rules of their society, of their culture, that was not appropriate at all in any shape, form, or fashion. And thus she refused. Now her punishment, she was removed to the second harem. You mean the king had two? Yes. She was, and we'll read through this later, she was removed from being queen. She was deposed. And the king had basically two harems. One that he frequented and one that he never saw. But they were supported by the kingdom. So we back up to Solomon's time. We read that Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. There's one kid said in Sunday school, 700 cucumber vines. And I've had students before say, wow, how did he do that? He probably didn't know any of them. Let your imagination go. He probably knew none of them, because this one was a present from this king. And she was brought in royal parade, presented to Solomon. That's nice. Next. And she's taken to the harem. Never sees her again. She's part of his, what's the right word here? His possessions, a demonstration of his power, a part of his kingdom, but was never his wife or his partner. So these served as insurance policies by these other kings. So if Solomon or any one of these kings said, it's springtime, we ought to have a good war. We need a good war. Looks at his little map there and he says, how about this place here? Oh no, you can't attack them because the king's daughter is part of your harem. Said, oh yeah, we got it. It's a peace treaty. This gift ensured that king that this king would not attack him. And if he did send out a message, we're coming your way, say, well, you remember, my daughter's in your harem, or my daughters, plural. And so that was kind of an insurance policy against this kind of embattlement. So a lot of these were never really noticed by the king. It wouldn't have happened, but had he met them on the street, he'd had no idea who they were. No idea at all, because they were part of that package of his wealth and his power and his kingdom. So her punishment was removal to the second harem. And I think I'm running out of time here. Yeah, we're getting close. Verse 13. The king said to his wise men who understand the times, it's the custom of the king to speak for those who knew law and justice. We'll come back to this next week. And one of them, Mimican, suggested at verse 16 that queen is not only wrong to king, but also all the princes and all the people in the provinces. She's not only wrong to king, she's wrong to everybody. And here's why. The king's conduct is going to become known to all the women, and they're going to look with contempt on their husbands. And so they write this decree that Vashti, verse 19, Vashti may no longer come into the presence of the king Ahasuerus, and that the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. And that'll make all the women know. This decree, and ladies, I couldn't think of a better way to say this. This decree was designed to keep the women in their place. Now, that's that culture, not ours. But that was their thinking. If the other women know that the queen is allowed to rebel against the king's order, then they're going to rebel against us, and we're going to have all kinds of social problems. That was their thinking. Incorrect, but that was their culture, not ours. So don't get your feelings hurt. I really believe that women have their proper place. I really believe that men have their proper place. And that place is described in Scripture. It is not demeaning to either one. It is God-given, God-approved, and God-glorified. It's not the place that Vashti was in, of course, or those women. But God sees these two as important people in His kingdom. And if we follow God's design, it'll work every time. If we do what God said to do, the way God said to do it, it'll always work out for the best. That just kind of works that way. So if we follow God's plan, we'll be doing all right. So we'll leave that. We'll come back to verse 10 or verse 13 next week and talk about this decree and how that panned out and how that affected the kingdom, how they got the news spread across. God bless you. Hope you have a great week. We're dismissed. Thank you.